Hi, well, I want to welcome you to what's going to be a new series of sermons for Picnic Church called the Centrality of Christ. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the small but significant words that the New Testament uses to describe what Jesus has done for us and our relationship with Jesus. And today we're going to kick that off by looking at the first 4 verses of the book of Hebrews. I wonder if you've been reading the book of Hebrews, if you've ever noticed something different about it from the other letters in the New Testament. Typically, the letters in the New Testament start from Paul to the church in Corinth, to Paul to the church in Rome, but there's none of that in the book of Hebrews, and that's because most scholars think the book of Hebrews is actually a sermon. And I sometimes wonder if the preacher had the same preaching professor as me, because I think I've told you before that my preaching professor always made us write out a sentence that would sum up the whole of the sermon, and that's exactly what is happening in the first 4 verses of the book of Hebrews. It's a very long sentence, 78 words in all, and it sums up everything that he's going to talk about in the rest of the book. So let's read it together, and as we do that, see if you can spot the significant word. In the past, God spoke to us through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And after he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. And so he became as much superior to the angels as the name he's inherited is superior to theirs. Now, I hope you notice that the significant word there is through. God does things for us through Jesus. And we could sum up what he does for us with 2 words, communication and commune. God communicates to us through Jesus. God also provides a way for us as human beings to commune, that is, have a relationship with him through Jesus. Now, theologians, when they're talking about this, don't use the word communication and communion. They use the word revelation and redemption. God reveals himself through Jesus so we can know him. And God redeems us from our sin so that we can come to him. So what we've been told is that personally this has implications for us. If we make this personal, we've been told that you can come to know God through Jesus, and that you can come into a personal relationship with God through Jesus. Through Jesus, God has done everything that needs to be done to enable us to both know him and be accepted into a relationship with him. Through Jesus, God has dealt with our ignorance that stopped us understanding him. And through Jesus, God has dealt with our sin that separated us from him and prevented him accepting us. You see, this sermon was preached to a group of Jewish Christians who were tempted to think that Jesus was optional, that they could either go back to Judaism or they could come to God through some sort of angels. And the preacher is saying, no, Jesus is indispensable to knowing God and coming to God. If you really want to know God, if you want to be accepted by God and have a relationship with God, Jesus is indispensable. Now let's think about why that is. And the first thing that God does for us through Jesus is that you can know God through Jesus. I wonder if anybody's ever said to you, I can't read your mind, meaning that they want you to tell them something. If you really want to know about someone, they have to speak to you, communicate to you. And that's exactly what the writer of Hebrews tells us that God has done. We have a God who speaks. The preacher says in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. And what he's talking about basically there is the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we hear God speaking through the words and actions of the prophets. And God is telling us about himself in the Old Testament. But that revelation, that revealing of God was progressive. As the Old Testament goes on, we learn more and more about God. He does it in different ways. But it's also partial. It's not the whole truth about God that we need to know. So having talked about the fact that God spoke to us in the Old Testament through the prophets, the writer now contrasts that with the fact that he's spoken to us in the last days. Now, I need to clear up some confusion here that's quite common. That phrase, the last days, does not mean the short period before Jesus returns. In the New Testament, the phrase the last days means the whole period between Jesus' birth, his life, his ascension, and his return. So the first generation of disciples lived in the last days, and we are living in the last days. And if there is another generation of Christians, they'll be living in the last days as well. So how does God speak to us now? In these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he has made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful works. So in the past, God spoke in lots of different ways to lots of different prophets, but now God has spoken finally and decisively and completely to us in just one way, through his Son. Through Jesus, God has revealed everything that we need to know and can know about himself. And that's because of who Jesus is. Now, if we had time to go into the rest of the book of Hebrews, we'd see that the writer emphasises that Jesus is 100% human, just like us. But right here in these opening verses, what he's emphasising is the fact that Jesus is also 100% God, right? Like God the Father. And he says that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory. So he takes us outside to the world of sunlight. And in the same way that sunlight is of the same substance of the sun, Jesus, as the radiance of God's glory, is the same substance as God. And what that means is he is 100% divine, just like the Father, not a lesser being, the exact same. And in case we were any doubt about that, he goes on, and instead of having us outside looking at the sun, he takes us inside to the kind of ancient office and looks at a seal and the impression it makes in the wax. And he says that Jesus is the exact representation of God's being. And when you look at an impression made by a seal in wax, in that impression you see exactly what the seal is like. And in the same way, whenever we look at Jesus, we see exactly what God is like. That's why Paul says in the book of Colossians that the Son is the image of the invisible God. Through Jesus, God the Father makes the truth about himself visible. The writer here is talking in the whole book about the incarnation, that God was 100% divine and 100% human at the same time. I'm constantly frustrated that my French is so bad that I can't communicate properly with people. Now, if you want to communicate with someone, you have to speak their language. And when God wanted to communicate with us as human beings, when he wanted us to know the final and the full truth about himself, what did he do? Well, in Jesus, he spoke human. He spoke the language that we could understand, a human life. And that's why John puts it in his gospel, that the Word was with God and was God, and the Word became flesh, fully human. And so Jesus is the final and the full revelation of what God is like. And this is just so important. This takes us to the very heart of the uniqueness of Christianity. You see, what's unique about Christianity is not simply that we believe that Christ was God. Here's a wonderful part. We believe that God is Christ-like. We believe that God is Christ-like. And that's why Jesus would say, anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. According to these opening verses of Hebrews, Jesus is the divine and decisive revelation of who God is. And here's what that means. If Jesus is a decisive revelation of who God is, he is also the radical redefinition of what God is like. Jesus is a radical redefinition for us of what God is like. Jesus redefines everything that we think about God. Everything that you think about God that contradicts what you see and hear in Jesus is wrong. The Victorian bishop, Archbishop Ramsay, put it like this: God is Christ-like, and in him there is no unChrist-likeness at all. I need to repeat that. God is Christ-like, and in him there is no unChrist-likeness at all. That was a Victorian bishop, a contemporary preacher called Bruxy Cavey. Puts the implications of these opening verses for how we understand God like this. If Jesus is really like God, we can have confidence that God is deeply compassionate, scandalously gracious, and infinitely loving. We can be sure that we are created and sustained by a God who is love. That the universe we live in is created and sustained by a being of love. In Jesus, we get the fullest and clearest picture of the heart of God, because Jesus is both human and divine. Everything about his life shows the truth about God to us. Do you have questions about what God is like? Well, whatever your question is, God says the answer is Jesus. God in Jesus' birth, in his life, in his teachings, supremely in his death, resurrection, and ascension, is speaking to us about what he's like, and he's pointing to Jesus and saying, I am like that. When I used to have to go to court as a police officer, I had to say that what the evidence I would give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, when God speaks to you about himself through Jesus, he's saying it's the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about myself that I'm revealing in Jesus. So that's the first thing. We can really know God through Jesus. The second thing is that we can be accepted by God through Jesus. For a couple of years, I worked on a production line in IBM making computer keyboards, and we weren't allowed to have seats on the production line, because you see, we were always meant to be at work keeping the robots running. We weren't allowed to sit down because our work wasn't finished till the end of the shift. Now, in the same way, in the temple where the priests offered the sacrifices, there were no seats. And there were no seats for exactly the same reason that there was no seats back in that production line in IBM in Greenup, because their work was never finished. The sacrifices they offered never finally dealt with sin. They had to be repeated. Now, in the same way that the prophets in the Old Testament never fully revealed the truth about God, The priests in the temple never fully and decisively dealt with human sin through their sacrifices. But the preacher says something great, and we can so easily miss it. After he had provided purification for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. I wonder if you got that. Jesus sat down. He sat down because his work was finished. Jesus sat down because he had dealt decisively and finally with your sin. The preacher is pointing us to the cross when he speaks about purifications for sin. And he's saying that Jesus on the cross dealt once and for all, finally, decisively, completely with your sin. He's purified you from the guilt and the stain and the penalty and the power of sin. And that means that a holy God, now that sin that separated you from him has been dealt with, can welcome you into a relationship with himself. Later on, if you hit chapter 10, the writer expands on this idea. He says, we have been made holy, that is acceptable to a holy God, through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus once and for all. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties again and again. He offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this priest, and that's Jesus, had offered once and for all one sacrifice for sin, he sat down. It's the great kind of catchphrase of the book of Hebrews: once and for all, finally, decisively, completely, once and for all, Jesus dealt with your sin on the cross so that you could come for God. And so what have we learned? We've learned that through Jesus, you can know God, really know him. And through Jesus, you can be accepted by God, your sins forgiven and welcomed in to a relationship with God. Jesus himself put the truth that we've been looking at like this in John 14. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. And that's John 14:6. Jesus says, if you want to know the truth about God, it comes through me. If you want to know the way to have a relationship with God, it comes through me. And so I guess I need to ask you as I end, have you come to God through Jesus? You know, if you never have, if you're not sure what that meant, if you're not sure how to do that, I'd love to talk to you about. Some of your Christian friends would too, if you have some. But you could email me at james@westlakechurch.com and we could have a discussion about what it means to know the truth about God through Jesus and to come into a relationship with God through Jesus. Isn't it wonderful? And it's just reminded us of the grace of God. God takes the initiative to reveal himself to you. And then he takes the initiative to draw you to him in a relationship with him. Let's live in that grace of God. Amen.